In the bicentennial celebration of America's independence, we are reminded that America's freedom has always been protected by patriots who are willing to answer the call to arms. Through these 200 years, citizens have left their homes and families to defend the interests of these United States. In 1776, Thomas Paine said, "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of his country. But he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman." After each conflict, some have returned who need more than our thanks and admiration. They need help. Our purpose and goal in the Veterans Administration is to provide that help. The Veterans Benefit story starts many years before the establishment of the United States. The first Veterans Benefit on record in America was enacted in 1636 by the Pilgrims of Plymouth Colony while they were at war with the Pico Indians. The law provided that if any man shall be sent forth as a soldier and shall return maimed, he shall be maintained competently by the colony during his life. Other colonies followed suit, and by the time the United States was welded together as a nation in 1776, the concept of benefits for veterans was well established. In fact, one of the first steps taken by the Continental Congress was to pass a federal pension law. In 1833, the U.S. Naval Home at Philadelphia began admitting officers and men of the Navy and Marine Corps, mostly veterans of the War of 1812. To care for veterans of the war with Mexico, the U.S. Soldiers' Home was opened at Washington, D.C. These facilities provided domiciliary care, with medical attention being secondary. In 1861, during the early days of the Civil War, the Secretary of War appointed a sanitary commission to study the medical and hospital problems of the Union armies. This commission provided temporary hospital or domiciliary care in various parts of the country for the soldiers until they were physically able to return to their homes. At the termination of hostilities of the Civil War, the number of disabled veterans, as well as those unable to cope with the economic strife of civil life, became so great as to induce Congress to pass legislation for the establishment of the National Home for Disabled Volunteer Soldiers in 1865. Branches were located primarily in the north and eastern states and provided both domiciliary and medical care. Congress enacted the first Medical Act in 1917 with a program administered by the War Risk Bureau. It provided clinics, medicine, and hospitalization for soldiers of World War I. The War Risk Bureau determined eligibility, and the Public Health Service provided the service through a system of leased hospitals and clinics. To consolidate veterans relief, the Veterans Bureau was established in 1921. This bureau absorbed the functions of the War Risk Bureau and the Public Health Service. Under authority of a law passed by Congress, President Hoover formed the Veterans Administration by executive order on July 21, 1930. The Veterans Administration took over the functions of the Pension Bureau, the National Home for Disabled Volunteer Soldiers, and the Veterans Bureau. In 1936, the Western Branch National Home for Disabled Volunteer Soldiers was renamed Wadsworth in honor of Colonel C.W. Wadsworth, who served as General Treasurer for the National Homes. In 1946, the station was formally designated as the Veterans Administration Center at Wadsworth, Kansas. As part of our bicentennial celebration, we want to review the history of the Veterans Administration Center at Leavenworth, Kansas, and to portray the services being provided at the present time.
After the Civil War, the city of Leavenworth was a beehive of activity. Using every mode of transportation of the era, people and freight came to or passed through Leavenworth. This was a prosperous city with the Missouri River levee as a doorstep and railroad depot with lines to all points west. Wagon trains were outfitted here, and families would launch from Leavenworth to their new homesteads. Fort Leavenworth to the north provided security to the frontier. The modern post featured wooden and stone buildings, and notable residents included General Custer. Many cavalry units paraded on the grounds during the period just after the Spanish-American War. With the wide streets and boardwalks, businesses flourished in Leavenworth. Merchants offered every commodity that could be had from the east. Leavenworth had many fine hotels. The National and the Planters were known as the best hotels north of St. Louis. Bachelors seeking their place on the frontier found rooms a comfortable place to spend leisure time. The Missouri River supplied the local fish markets. Industry located here and manufacturing drew even more attention to this frontier city. One could expect a circus to make its way to Leavenworth, and they came not only to perform, but to purchase equipment manufactured here. Coal was being mined near Leavenworth. The Star of the West was a typical saloon in a frontier town. People worked hard, but there was time for relaxation with their families. It may have been a leisure Sunday afternoon or a visit to the opera. It was in the spring of 1878 that the Grand Army of the Republic held its reunion at Leavenworth. This was a patriotic organization of Civil War veterans who served in the Union forces. The idea of establishing a soldiers' home at Leavenworth was born at this reunion. Because a number of the Grand Army of the Republic members were influential citizens in the state of Kansas and also in the city of Leavenworth, the project was accepted by the people. A site southeast of Leavenworth was selected for the home. This land had belonged to a small band of Christian Indians, the Munseys, who were permitted to settle on the land to include Mount Muncie Cemetery, all of St. Mary's, and VA Center. These Indians only stayed about 4 years and left. By act of Congress, they were authorized to sell the land in 1858. By the time the city became interested in the property, it belonged to several individuals, having been divided into smaller tracts. Much effort was expended to interest the Board of Governors of the National Home for Disabled Volunteer Soldiers to locate a branch at Leavenworth. Mayor S.F. Neely acquired 640 acres in his name for the city and was financed by selling bonds to the public. By offering this property and promising to donate $50,000 for improvements at the site, they made an agreement in 1884 with the Board of Governors to locate the home here. Finding the $50,000 difficult to come by and not being able to issue more bonds, the city made a later agreement with the Board of Governors to make semi-annual payments over 10 years, beginning with the construction of the home. The National Home for Disabled Volunteer Soldiers Western Branch would be a reality. The crowded electric streetcar line connecting the Soldiers' Home and Leavenworth in 1905 is an indication of the association that was to follow. On May 16, 1885, a contract for the erection of 10 brick buildings was let to Mr. James A. McGonigal. Construction began immediately, and from then through 1886, 17 buildings were constructed. 13 of these were barracks. They were erected on the crest of the ridge in a row that curved with the contour of the hill. They were flanked by 2 streets simply named Front Street and Back Street. These were large 2-story brick buildings designed as 2 wings connected together with an entry that afforded wide open staircases. Open porches were on each level. The hospital built in 1886 was to the southeast of the living quarters. This was a 3-story building, the 3rd story being utilized by the use of dormers in the roof. The original building was a 2-wing structure similar to the barracks. A wing was later added to the north. For the construction of these buildings, clay was taken from directly in front of the hospital building and fired into brick at the site. Having made a large crater in the ground, it was later landscaped and formed Lake Jeanette, named after the first chief surgeon's daughter. The building to house the power plant and its smokestack were also constructed in 1886. That stack belched coal smoke until 1932, when it was replaced with the present tower. The dining hall was one of the major structures built in 1886. It was said to be the largest facility of its kind in Kansas, and for many years accommodating 1,200 men for a meal. It too was built in stages with additions or major changes in 1908 and 1938. The initial appropriation by Congress for this construction was $250,000, with other appropriations later. The barracks cost an average of about $28,000 each, and the dining hall cost about $103,000 to build. Construction continued at the home with many notable landmarks. Decorating the intersection was a large fountain donated by Anheuser-Busch in 1892. In 1901, it was moved and later demolished in 1934. A goldfish pond was also beside the entrance to the home. The first bandstand in front of the dining hall only survived 5 years. It was torn down in 1892 to make way for a much larger one. This ornate structure had lamps lighting the dome and perimeter. Restroom facilities were provided in the basement. Although not as massive, an equally decorative bandstand was built in the lake in front of the hospital. It provided an excellent setting for band concerts and could be enjoyed by patients at the hospital. It was dismantled in 1936 because of its deteriorated condition. The Ward Memorial Building was first used as the headquarters building, with the library being on the second floor. A stained glass window designed with a life-size figure of Mr. Lincoln is over the staircase. The inscription, dated 1887, identifies the window as a gift from the Grand Army of the Republic by the citizens of St. Louis, Missouri. Among the first buildings constructed was the laundry, still in use today, and a psychiatric building behind the first hospital. The stable, although located away from the barracks complex, was designed along the same lines as the other buildings. The exterior walls were brick with stone foundation. Living quarters were provided on the second floor for men who handled the horses. It was destroyed by fire in 1926 and rebuilt in 1927 as a garage and fire station. The chapel, built in 1893, has attracted national interest from the days of its construction. The Gothic design differs from the architecture of the other buildings of the home. A unique feature is that it is arranged for Catholic services on the ground floor, while Protestant services are being held in the upper level. Each of the stained glass windows has a theme visible from both inside and outside. From the Protestant chapel, the east window depicts a religious theme, while the theme in the west window is patriotic. In the Catholic chapel, the religious theme is on the west window, and the patriotic theme is on the east. This building was built as a hospital annex, but was better known as the band barracks. The architect who designed the chapel displayed his technique in this building, having built them the same year. The band quarters were demolished in 1941. This large building was built in 1900 as a hotel and theater. It may not have been as widely acclaimed as the National Hotel in Leavenworth, but it did offer all the modern conveniences. The home store and newsstand were operated in the hotel. The back part, and occupying the largest share of the building, was the theater. The auditorium had wooden seats and a balcony. The state hosted popular personalities of the day and many local talent groups who performed free to the veterans. The hotel part was closed in 1946, and the theater was condemned and the building demolished in 1959. The last major building constructed at the turn of the century was the headquarters building in 1902. Other impressive buildings constructed were the residences for key personnel. These were built over a 20-year period beginning in 1885. Close to the hospital were homes for the surgeons, subsistence officer, and treasurer, to name a few. This residence has been the home of every governor or manager of the soldiers' home. The first story is constructed of stone and the second story of wood. Through the years of maintenance and remodeling, some decorations were changed and the porch was screened in, but the building is essentially the same as it was originally constructed. The quartermaster's home is an all-brick building. It too is similar to its original construction. These two buildings were located on the site of the present hospital, and just prior to that construction in 1930, they were moved intact to their present location by the north gate to the station. The first soldiers were admitted to the home on September 1st, 1885. The character of the soldiers' home reflected a military atmosphere from its activation through the early 1900s. Members were required to wear uniforms and were organized along military lines into companies. Formations were required, and members were subject to the rules and articles of war. Whether the occasion be the daily retreat ceremony or a visiting dignitary, regimentation was evident. Having been volunteer soldiers, most would not object to this lifestyle. The military was closely associated with the home, with troops from Fort Leavenworth participating on special occasions at the soldiers' homes. The barracks provided each man with an adequate place to call his home. Initially, the members were predominantly Civil War veterans, and the barracks were segregated by military background. Before the laundry was constructed, the men set up a self-service laundry. Aside from the organized activities, there was time for leisure. In their free time, the men could be found relaxing on Front Street or fishing in Lake Jeanette. Mineral water was thought to be good for whatever ails you. The mineral spring east of the hospital was a popular place for the men to congregate. Other men found the dugout a favorite place of retreat. Although still a recreation building, beer has not been sold since the mid-1930s, when the Board of Managers were pressured by temperance groups to stop the practice. In the late 1880s, before the streetcar line came to the Veterans Home, the soldiers had no transportation to Leavenworth. A Colonel Scott, recognizing this need, paid $4,000 for a carriage that sported French plate mirrors, silk curtains, and 10 leather chairs. The carriage was pulled by 4 horses, providing free transportation to Leavenworth for the soldiers. It was purchased later by William Owen for $50 and used as a restaurant on Cherokee Street in Leavenworth as late as 1930. The Soldiers' Home had a band comprised of members who had served as musicians in their military service. They were quartered in separate barracks and at one time had a fife and drum corps. They participated in funeral services and each Memorial Day led the march from the barracks to the cemetery. Veterans followed the band, and civilians, including children, came next. A flag was placed on every grave. The band was part of the retreat and reveille each day, and they held band concerts on Sundays and holidays. They also played in the theater while silent movies were shown. The civilian community had always been involved in the home, and the early days saw visitors admiring the facilities. On Sundays and holidays, families gathered for picnics by Lake Jeanette and enjoyed band concerts and boating on the lake. The Soldiers' Home was chosen as the starting place for bicycle races, and young men of the community came to compete. The logistics to operate the home took on many forms. With over 100 cows, the home operates its own dairy. That operation ceased in 1934 when fresh milk was available from local sources. At one time, beef and pork were raised at the home. This rock crusher provided the means to modernize the dirt streets before brick was used. The steam engine provided stationary power. The home operated its own ice plant, and daily deliveries were made to the kitchens and hospital. Ms. Martha J. Smith was the first matron of the home. Organizing the workforce to care for the soldiers was a challenging task. It was said her executive ability and her pleasing personality won for her the love and respect of all. The culinary department of the hospital was regarded as the most excellent, and Mrs. Smith was credited with stimulating a home-like spirit in the staff and soldiers. There were several kitchens in operation at the home. Young ladies were on the staff to prepare and serve food.
Well, I was 16 when I started to work at the Soldiers' Home, and I worked at the hospital in the kitchen and the dining room. And we used the elevator to bring the foods to the kitchen on the second floor, and the dining room was on the first floor. We served meals family style, and they got all they wanted to eat. We worked 7 days a week. One day each week we were excused for the evening meal, and when we finished the noon meal we had the afternoon off. Other days we served all 3 meals, and had some free time between to freshen up and relax on the porch and watch the people go by. We were required to live in the dormitory and was on the 3rd floor of the hospital. We had to have a pass to go out at night, and were required to be in by 10. If we were going to be late, the night cook would fix us a sandwich from the kitchen, and we thought he was great.
By 1914, the horse was being replaced, and the home had this motorized ambulance. Being one of the first motorized vehicles at the home, it was used for all types of errands, such as picking up the cash for the payroll. John Denny Sr. was the driver. From the beginning, the grounds of the home have impressed visitors with its beauty and neat appearance. Around 1900, Mr. Carl Klein was responsible for the grounds, and later his son took his place. One attraction was the World. Erected by the dining hall, this floral sculpture was arranged with plants of various colors, trimmed round like a globe, and continents showing in colors. A greenhouse provided flowers and plants for the hospital, dining rooms, and funerals. The peaceful setting of Lake Jeanette with its bandstand, the bandstand on the front lawn, the fountain, the 175-foot wooden flag pole, and the hotel were all attractions to visitors at the Soldiers' Home. In the early days, a cannon was used in the retreat ceremony. Later, they decorated the lawn in rows, silent testimony of a bygone era. Time, the elements, and progress have taken their toll in removing these landmarks. Only one Spanish gun remains on the front lawn today. It was captured by Admiral Dewey at San Felipe near Manila. It was made in Spain in 1856. The cemetery at the National Home for Disabled Volunteer Soldiers, Western Branch, was established with the burial of Thomas Brennan on January 22, 1886. Overlooking the Missouri River Valley from the highest ridge of the cemetery stands an obelisk appropriately inscribed. From 1886 to 1941, some early governors of the home and their families were buried in this section. During the excavation for building number 122, the remains of 12 Indians were uncovered and reinterred in the only mass grave within the cemetery. These could have been the Muncie Indians who resided on the property in the early 1800s. Veterans from every war were interred here, totaling over 12,000. The cemetery became the responsibility of the National Cemetery System in 1974. When the Veterans Administration was established in 1930, most of the branches of the former National Home for Disabled Volunteer Soldiers began placing more emphasis on hospital facilities. At the home at Leavenworth, a new and modern hospital was completed in 1933. While this facility offered excellent medical treatment, the domiciliary was still the dominant activity until it was closed in 1944. The decision had been made to convert the home to a neuropsychiatric hospital, and all domiciliary members had been transferred to other homes throughout the country. Before this conversion was completed, however, the plan was dropped. In 1946, the domiciliary was reopened, but the hospital and medical program has received greater emphasis since that time.